Welcome to Banyan Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyan.com. Since 1970, Banyan Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyan.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Branches of Wisdom, the Banyan Books podcast. I'm your host, Ross McKeechee, and very delighted today to be joined by Neal Allen and Anne Lamott. Before we get to their intro, I want to let everybody know that although we have people joining from all over the world for these live streaming events, the physical location of Banyan Books and Sound is on the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Most of Banyan's events and podcasts are free. We welcome your donations to keep these programs accessible for all. Just click on the PayPal link in the show description below. Also letting you know that towards the end of our conversation with Neal and Anne today, we will take questions from you, the live audience. So please go ahead and type those into the chat or the comments field on YouTube, and we'll get to as many as we can. Our guest today, Anne Lamott, is the renowned humorist and New York Times bestselling author of 19 novels and books of nonfiction, including the classic on writing, Bird by Bird. Some of her beloved books include Operating Instructions, Hallelujah Anyway, Help, Thanks, Wow, and Traveling Mercies. Her work is often quoted by the likes of Brené Brown and Elizabeth Gilbert, and she is a past recipient of the Guggenheim Fellowship and an inductee to the California Hall of Fame. Anne has a new book coming out in April 2024 called Somehow, Thoughts on Love. Neal Allen is a writer, spiritual coach, and speaker whose chief interest is removing obstacles of the ego. A former journalist and corporate executive, he holds master's degrees in political science and in Eastern classics. His first book, released in 2021, was called Shapes of Truth: Discover God Inside You. Today, Anne and Neal are with Banyan Books in conversation about Neal's new book, Better Days, Tame Your Inner Critic, in which Anne wrote the foreword. In Better Days, Neal Allen asks us the revolutionary question, what if our inner critic is wrong? Through simple and engaging exercises and explorations, Better Days offers a process for meeting, confronting, and ultimately quieting the inner critic. It is a book that can change your life. And we're also going to get into a little bit of conversation with Neal and Anne about their life together as writers. So Banyan community, a warm and exciting welcome for Anne Lamott and Neal Allen. Hello.
Hello. Hi, community.
So great to have you guys with us.
Great to be here.
How did you guys meet? How long ago was that?
It was 7.5 years ago. It was the end of August of 2016. And we've been married. We're coming up on 5 years. We got married 3 days after I qualified and started getting Social Security.
We've been married through the age of Trump.
Yes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Another way of looking at it. Oh, no, we've known each other through the age of Trump. We've been married through the age of COVID.
Right.
Yeah.
Did those things strengthen your relationship, do you think?
Well, the night of the election in 2016, when I was very, very excited for America to have its first woman president, someone who I happen to really love and respect, Hillary Clinton. Neal was in the East Bay, and we'd only been together two months anyway, so we were in that just fog of adrenalized love for each other. And here we were going to be celebrating this incredible milestone. I'm almost 70, and I'd been hearing and thinking and hoping for this my whole life. And then all of a sudden, things started to go south on me. But there was a miracle, and the miracle was that Neal was going to be coming over later. In the same shape I was in, which was a gape.
Yeah.
And so that was really the first thing that helped me survive those 4 years, was getting through that first night. And then with COVID, because we're both writers, our life doesn't really change all that much, whether we're sequestered or not, because he's over here in his man cave and I'm over in my house in my girl cave. And we're just sort of doing our own thing a lot of the time, and we bump into each other in the kitchen, or we end up on the couch reading together or watching MSNBC. And so COVID did for us what it did for everybody, which it helped us become more contemplative. We couldn't be the extremely busy people with long to-do lists that involved getting out, and we all of a sudden, getting out meant walking 6 feet apart from our neighbors and waving to them. And so, I think it was a really profoundly spiritual 3 years for the nation. And it was for us because we had this thing happen, which was we had COVID buddies.
And we're both capable of being extroverts, but more likely to be found in introverted situations. And I think generally speaking, COVID was fine for introverts, and had this funny effect that a lot of people who, whether introverted or extroverted, had been very busy and found themselves less busy, discovered that in having more time with themselves, that they actually liked themselves. Now, it was terrible for 13-year-olds. It was terrible for people in the courting stage of life. It was terrible for certain kinds of extroverts.
And
right?
For the poor.
And for the poor. But it was also terrific for a lot of people.
Yeah, I certainly found solace in a lot of the alone time that I had during the lockdowns as well. Now, Annie, of course, you've been a published author for many, many years. Neal, your first book was released in 2021, but you had a career as a journalist before that. Can you just give us a little bit of the story of your trajectory to being a journalist and executive, and then becoming a spiritual coach and author?
Yeah, there isn't really a logical trajectory to it. So I was a journalist as a do-gooder. When I came out of school, I wanted a public service career, and I came out of school at the time of Woodward and Bernstein, and so journalism was a romantic, exciting way to serve the public. And I did that until I had a family, and to eventually 4 children, and I switched to a corporate career quite happily. I didn't have a big. Some people who are journalists find it a little wrenching to do PR and marketing because it feels like a lie. And I had to get through that period, and I certainly didn't like PR for that, but I did other things in my corporate life. And I loved eventually I really loved working in these kind of Darwinian sinks with pyramids, and the alpha at the top and the sub alphas trying to beat them down. And I found it really quite comical in a certain way. And I rose through the ranks and of a corporate career, ending up in pharmaceuticals for a long time. Somewhere along the line, I think it was just I was taken by a friend to a one-day retreat, not a retreat, but a one-day session with Adyashanti a modern master who just retired. And his singular purpose in the world seemed, I learned later, seems to be to awaken people who otherwise aren't aware of the awaken them to awakening, right? And he did that with me. And there was kind of a miraculous experience that I had that served to take me out of my atheistic, rationalistic, that's what you see is what you get, that's the only way to look at the world. And took me into the possibility that there was more, that there was a different metaphysics to the world than empirical materialism. And I just got excited and started moving my interests into that world and did various studies. And I lucked into a therapist who had been in the Rajneesh movement, and then he introduced me to.
Was that Birnbaum? Was that his name?
Yeah, Bob Birnbaum, and then
Yeah.
he introduced me to Hamid Ali's mystery school called Diamond Heart.
A.H. Almas, right?
A.H. Almas, he writes prolifically as. And I did Diamond Heart, which is particularly strong in removing the objects of the ego, or at least displacing them temporarily, and taught me a lot about what my inner critic was, what my superego is. There's a lot of Diamond Heart in me, all right, to this day. And my first book was actually written more or less in tribute to Hamid Ali. I just noticed that there was something he hadn't written about that I thought deserved to be written about. And so I wrote that first book. And he helped me. He edited 2 or 3 versions of it and got the details right in certain places. And then I was just it was no longer time for me to belong to anything. And so for the last 10 years or so, I've just been, even though I'd already left Diamond Heart when I wrote that book. And I just kind of find it interesting to look for ways to expand my potential for freedom, my objectivity, my participation in love and truth, and those sorts of things. And that, because my default, I've always been a writer, right? As a default kind of mastery, it makes sense that I write books about it. If I had found myself a geologist, interested in geology at this point in my life, I'd write books about geology. Right? So it happens that I spend my time being interested in freedom of a certain sort, and so I write about that kind of freedom of a certain sort.
Yeah. And Annie, you come from a Christian background. So what's the connecting point for you guys in terms of your
I actually come from an atheist background. My parents were very staunch atheists and very devout. And in my 20s, very early 20s, but I'd always believed secretly in God. And I just tried to avoid the whole Jesus thing because that was just such anathema to my parents. But I have a kind of ecumenical faith, very Jesus-y, but also really guided in my 20s by Ram Dass and by the Seventh Story Mountain, Thomas Merton, and by, my mind will go blank right now, but from a lot of different directions and sources. And when I met Neal, I converted drunk when I was, I got sober when I was 32 in 1986. And I started going to this funny little black failing church, which is still a funny little failing church, in 85 when I was 31. And I converted there. And yet I didn't know what Neal knew. So I met Neal in 2016. And what he knew about was the inner critic that Better Days is about. And he started, I think, on our second date, talking to me about this, what he describes in his book as a parasite, this voice that has accompanied me since I was a small child that keeps me scared and small. And he taught me the work that, well, he'll demonstrate, but that he also writes about, of identifying it as not being truth, not being even me, but being something that I have listened to and felt very pretzelized by for my entire life. And so at the age of, what would that make me? Was I 63? Do you remember? 7 years? About, yeah. He started teaching me that when I feel stressed or overloaded or bored, I start to hear this voice he calls the inner critic that says, oh my God, don't even try that, because your inside self might show and everybody will see how vulnerable you really are, or you might make a mistake. And in our family, we didn't make mistakes. We really didn't. I was saddled with this disease of perfectionism that I wrote about a lot in Bird by Bird. And that was, don't ever make a mistake. You know, figure it out, make a decision, stick to it. And Neal's trip was mistakes and messes are fertile field for the writer. You know, he was writing from the awareness of mistakes and messes, and he doesn't even, I mean, this was so radical and kind of annoying, he doesn't even acknowledge that mistakes are mistakes. And so I started doing the work then, and he taught me to identify, to hear, to go, oh, it's not good instruction. It might have been when I was 6 years old and I was spaced out. I'm still spaced out. And I might have run out into the street. I might have swum out too far. But now at 70, it's not helpful. It's in fact destructive to my soul, to my spiritual self, and to the creative woman of me. And so that's what the transition was that I had God, I had a lot of beautiful, beautiful teachers, books, poetry, and practices, but I had this inner critic that I didn't ever have a path of dealing with until I started doing the work Neal is talking about and writing about.
In one way, I can kind of understand what you're saying, but in another way, it's so funny to hear you say, I was instructive in some way to you on the subject of spending time with your messes, right? Since that's what you do in your books,
Mm-hmm.
right? And when I met Annie, first of all, her being Jesus-y was fine with me, right? Because there's a kind of Jesus-y-ness that even when I was an atheist, I appreciated. So I taught Sunday school as an atheist. I love the gospel stories. You know, I love Job and the gospel stories. Those kind of are always fallbacks for how to look at the world honestly. And that's the kind of Jesus-y way that Annie is, right? It's not the kind of pulpit social justice or hierarchical behaviors that show up in the religion. So what stunned me when I met Annie was that I was actually in the presence of somebody who was perfectly happy to look at her own vulnerability as not a weakness, but a superpower. And I remember about a week into our going out, we went on one, what was it, breakfast date, I guess. And we met over coffee and breakfast. And from that day, we have spent every day together, unless one of us was out of town. Right. So we just started a conversation that just continues and continues and continues. She'll say, sometimes I talk too much. And so the conversation can be a bit much. But but about a week into this conversation, I remember just looking at her and going, oh, you mean I can be kind all the time? And I'm not sure I had ever spent time with somebody who goes through life that way, assuming that you can be kind in any situation with anybody at any time.
Wow.
And so if she remembers me as being in some kind of way instructive or guidance, having some kind of guidance, it was something that she already knew so much about that she was open to just a slightly different take on it.
Annie and Neal, have you found that this work with taming the inner critic actually opens up more to your relationship with God?
Oh,
Oh,
absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely. Because um, before I had that tool, and I did have other tools. I mean, I've been in recovery coming up on 38 years, and I had a lot of, I know that the spiritual tools of writing and of God boxing problems and of taking my problems to other people and saying, do you have a minute? I need a listener, and I need spiritual counsel. And I do read the scripture, but there had been this voice, and I have written about it a lot, but it doesn't mean that I'm not going to keep, and I have lived in my vulnerability and in the kindness and in the path of having an open and loving heart. But some days go better than others, and people might still hurt me or judge me. I'm a writer. I'm getting a bad review tomorrow night in Kirkus. The hell with them. They're a terrible site. But anyway, I got a great review in PDEP Publishers Weekly for somehow everyone should know. But like, I'm going to get criticized publicly. When I get criticized, it goes public. And I didn't have the tool of stopping it in its trance. Before, it could be days where I was in the shame spiral because of the voice telling me I've made a mistake, I've screwed up, I haven't adhered to the value of perfectionism with which I was raised. And so now it doesn't go a day, something bad, something scary, something where somebody turns on me or says something will happen because we live in community. And I'll take it to Neal, and he'll say, oh, that's Andrea. That's your inner critic, and it's distressing guys as Andrea. And Andrea is reaffirming all those same things that you heard in kindergarten and first grade, that I need to do better. I need to need less, and then everything will be fine. I need to dance a little faster. I need to people please instead of God please, And so Neal will say, oh, it's just that you're inner critic. And I'll go, oh, I forgot. And then I'll say, well, I really am looking forward to Neal doing some work with you, because then I'll be able to talk about how its relationship to God more with the audience being in on it.
Yeah.
That sounds great. Okay.
Yeah. I'll just add one thing, which is kind of jumping. You're kind of jumping to the end of the book, and the end of the book is about how your inner critic turns out to be the primary maintainer or developer and maintainer of the personality that's your defensive shield as you operate in the world. And so as the inner critic moves to the side, so does the defensive shield. And I'm not concerned with what appears as long as my defensive shield is gone. If my defensive shield is gone, then I am intimate with the world. And that means I am in some way or another involved with the world of truth and love, in particular, if I'm in relation with somebody. And, the love may simply be a word that we use to mean intimate relation, right? It just means that I'm unseparated. And the only thing in the way of my being intimate that I've found that's a strong force in my life is this parasitic voice that is claiming that I need to default to distrust and default to fear instead of default to trust and default to acceptance. So while my work is relatively mechanical, I basically describe in the book one central tool and then a dozen other tools to repetitively work on getting my inner critic's voice out of the way. Whatever appears is God or the divine or consciousness, because those are just words for being intimate with what is and unseparated with what is. And that naturally brings you into the present. I don't have to like try to get present. I don't have to try to get rid of my past or try to stop projecting into the future. All I have to do is get rid of the thing that makes me devote myself to bettering myself in a near future, rather than accepting and noticing what's lovely right here, right now.
So as you said, we kind of have jumped a bit to the end of the book, but bringing us back to the beginning, just for our audience to understand, you liken our inner critic to a parasite, and you say this parasite is what Freud called the superego.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what that means, how it forms, and then it continues to operate in us?
Yeah, I'll give. It's very interesting to me, and I think it's interesting to most people. But I'll give a very short description of it. Freud noticed that we have a three-part ego, and he divided it into an id, a superego, and then confusingly, ego means all three and is also the name for something that kind of manages between the id and the superego. The id is just two instincts, survival and libido. And so that's its own world. That's the world of fight or flight, fight, flight, or freeze, right? That's its own world. There's a separate world that has nothing to do with survival or libido that we live in, that's called our social world. And our social world is all of our little human laws, right? Survival is outside of the system of human laws, and it's autonomic responses, and it's very it doesnst have to be regulated. We just do survival. Libido is a little different, but I don't go there. Which, by the way, most spiritual books don't go to libido. It's just a very, very difficult subject. But so the social world is the world of getting liked by people, getting approved by people, getting appreciated by people, getting your way, resolving conflicts, non-necessary urgent things that irritate us, non-necessary urgent things that delight us. Those are all the world of the superego. For us in a modern civilization, they're 99.99% of the moments of our lives, right? We're not in unless I've got a rattlesnake in front of me on a trail, I am not in survival. I have food, shelter, clothing, and safety solved, right? Most days, all the time. Not sure that I haven't had them solved every day of my life, right? And because food survival isn't I have food right in front of me. It is that I can trust that I won't die of starvation in the next week. Right. Now, tribal people, they can't trust that, right? There can be a drought and they can die of starvation if they're in a hunting gathering Stone Age tribal community. I don't ever experience that. Almost all of my life is spent in this social world. Freud thought, weirdly, but it made sense because he bought into the kind of Judeo-Christian bad seed myth that there was a war between the id and the superego and it had to be managed. There's no such war. There's just the superego operating all the time, reminding me of the human laws, right? Very, very important that I learn the human laws, particularly when I'm 6 years old. Until I'm 6 years old, I've been hovered over by adults enough that I have not been allowed to make fateful decisions for myself, right? I've also not learned any real cause and effect, free will tools, right? Until you're 6, when you're 0 through 5, you're mostly operating exactly the same way that a dog does, maybe a little different, but similarly to the way a dog does, where you're associating things with pleasurable and painful feelings in response. You're not learning by the rote of the words. Your parents think you are, right? They think that every time they scold you and say certain words, that those words actually mean something to you in terms of patterns for the future. But in fact, kids until they're 6 years old have very little pattern recognition. And you really see it when you see a parent pulling up a child angrily because they've knocked all the cereal boxes off of the shelf in the grocery store, and they remember they had told you that that the week before that you can't knock the coffee tins off the shelves and get joy out of that, and you were supposed to know the same. Most of the time when you see a parent scolding a child, the first reaction of the 5 or under child is, what did I do?
Mm-hmm.
It's a stunning lack of cause and effect, and they're mainly living in kid world. At 6 years old, it's assumed that it's time now to teach you up into adult world, to get you out of kid world and into adult world. And for the first time, you're sitting in rows and everybody's doing arithmetic, 45 minutes, and you don't get to go off to your own little PlayStation or learning station and decide for yourself. And if you need to pee, you have to squirm and raise your hand. You can't just walk up to the teacher and tug on them and ask them to take you to the bathroom. And, all these hall passes, all this sort of stuff shows up pretty much overnight. And at the same time, you're let off the leash. So you are allowed 15-minute periods of the day where you can make a fateful decision for yourself. You might be allowed to cross a crowded street. I mean, all of a sudden, you could make the decision of walking in front of a car and getting creamed, right? So at 6 years old, for everybody, right around 6 years old, whether you live in the United States or in Senegal or in India, anywhere in the world that's a civilized society, which is just about everywhere, a little voice shows up and says, I got this for you. And that little voice is a facsimile of a parent who you carry around with you to prevent you from making mistakes, and particularly in fateful decisions. It will also help you with raising your hand, but its first and essential job is to get you across that street safely. And to do that, because it's teaching you fateful decisions, it's negative reinforcement, right? You don't teach a kid not to not to cross the street without looking both ways in a nice NVC voice, right? It's a fateful decision, and the acceptable voice across all cultures is a frowning parent scolding you to make sure that you realize there's a punishment if you get this wrong, right? It makes sense. If you get it wrong, the punishment is nothing compared to being creamed by a car, right? So we carry a punishing voice that shows up. Its only actual punishment is a frown, the frown of an absent parent, right? Most people, 80% of people, it's the frown of a nagging mother. 20%, most of the rest of the 20%, the voice sounds like the disciplining, stern voice of an angry father. Some smaller percentage can be another authority, and some people for a long time just think it's their own voice, right? And it serves a great purpose. It saves your life in fateful decisions as you learn the rules, right? By the time you're 12 and it's been bullying you, you've learned most of the rules, most of the social rules, the fateful ones and the social ones. By the time you're 17, you've learned them all. You are a perfectly moral person. Being a moral person means you know the rules. It doesn't mean you act them out efficiently or correctly all the time, right? You can still break moral rules and be a moral person. Being moral just means you know the rules. At that point, you could discard this frowning parent who's hovering over and treating you like a 6-year-old, but nobody does. Because the frowning parent who's hovering over you and treating you like a 6-year-old loves its job. It loves running the show. And so most people die in the time leading up to their death. They have never released themselves from having a frowning parent looking over them and bullying them. Part of the day, some of the day, part of the week, some of the week, right? So, like everybody, I thought that the voice in my head was my conscience, and I bought into the Jiminy Cricket story, and I thought that I needed it, and I thought it was me, and I thought I was talking to myself, right? And something happened to me one day where it objectified itself and popped up on my shoulder as a gremlin. And I discovered that it wasn't me and that it was actually talking to an authentic me that was quite different. And I got into a dialogue with it. And that led to the discoveries and the tools that I use, which ultimately show people, number one, it's not you. Number two, you don't need it. And number three, you'll actually be, if any, at least as moral a person without it. And so
Okay.
what's it doing bullying you and making you feel bad all day long? So I'll show it to you. And
yes, let's see.
People can follow along. And we'll talk about it afterwards. But this is when you hear a bullying voice inside you, what is it saying to you?
For me, it's often I'm afraid of doing something wrong or just generally getting it wrong, and the sort of feeling of being ashamed or condemned for that.
Okay, and so that's partly a response to it. What are its actual words to you? When you hear it, what does it say?
I guess it says to me, like, kind of keep quiet,
Mm-hmm.
just listen and sit back.
Yeah, keep quiet, listen. What about, I can't believe you did that again? What about, I'm not sure you're going to be able to, I'm not sure you deserve to do this. Or what about, oh, you're faking it, or you're procrastinating, or you're lazy.
Yeah, all of those things.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
the sense of being an imposter in
Oh,
yeah.
Yeah. So when you hear the words coming at you, do they have the inflections of anybody from your childhood?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, for sure. The voice of both of my parents, depending on what the circumstance is.
Okay.
Yeah.
And where in your physical geography, your body geography, do you hear it? Do you hear the voice emanating from?
Well, I guess, yeah, it would be in and around my head.
Okay.
Yeah.
In and around your head. Most people, that's where, but some people feel it in the solar plexus, some a little lower. One thing to notice is that it's near the surface, right? It's not embedded deeply inside you, right? Your survival skills are, your authentic self are. It's kind of a tip, a clue that maybe it isn't an inborn thing. Maybe it's a construction and a facsimile of a inborn thing. So what I'm going to ask you to do, this is kind of a trippy thing, and people who are watching can follow along and do this themselves, right? And is pull your inner critic out of your head where it's been hanging out and hold it in front of you and look at your palm and tell me whether a face appears in your palm.
I see both of my parents.
You see both of your parents. So merge them into one and tell me what it looks like.
Yeah, it almost looks like a kind of like a witch.
Okay, so you got a witch. It might be other people might see a soccer ball or a blob or one of their parents in a kind of cartoon version or anything. It can be a person, creature, thing. I'm going to feed you some questions. You're going to ask the question aloud of your fake parent. We'll call it fake parent, okay? And it will answer and repeat aloud its answer so that all of us can hear it. And by the way, I do this with my private clients, and I do it as a parlor trick at dinner too. First thing, what's its expression?
Yeah, it's scowling.
Yeah, scowling, right? The emotional range of your inner critic is very, very narrow. Everybody's inner critic only really goes from scorn to anger, right? Doesn't really participate in emotions of love, right? It's a facsimile of a person. And so anyway, we'll talk a little more about that. So the first question to ask it is, when did you take charge?
When did you take charge? It's 11 months.
Okay. Who put you in charge?
Who put you in charge? It says, well, your parents and you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why are you still in charge?
Why are you still in charge? It's kind of saying, well, you let me and you need me.
Okay. Are you worried something bad will happen if I take charge?
Are you worried that something bad will happen if I take charge? Yeah.
What are you worried will happen?
What are you worried will happen? Yeah, I guess that things will fall apart.
Okay. I'd like to take charge. Is that okay?
I'd like to take charge. Is that okay? It's kind of sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
What makes you think things will fall apart?
What makes you think things will fall apart? It's kind of saying, well, I'm holding everything together. I'm the one holding everything together.
Yeah. Well, I think I can hold things together, and I'd like to do this as an experiment. Is that okay?
Well, I think I can hold things together, and I'd like to do this as an experiment. Is that okay? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
I need a really positive affirmation, not just a yeah.
Okay. Is that okay if I, as an experiment, I take charge for a while? Yes. Okay.
Okay. Are you worried something bad will happen to you if I take charge?
Are you worried something bad will happen to you if I take charge? Well, yeah, I'll disappear.
Yeah. I promise I won't annihilate you.
Okay. I promise I won't annihilate you.
Isn't it tiring running the show all the time?
Isn't it tiring running the show all the time? Yeah.
How would you like to go into semi-retirement as my occasional ethical advisor?
How would you like to go into semi-retirement as my occasional ethical advisor? Yeah, it sounds good. It does.
Yeah. I know this isn't going to be easy for you, but I appreciate that you're going to help me by staying out of the picture for a while.
I know this isn't going to be easy for you, but I hope you can help me by just staying out of the picture for a little while.
And I want to thank you for saving my life when I was a kid.
And I want to thank you for saving my life when I was a kid.
What's its expression now?
It's smiling.
Yeah. Now put it back into your head.
Okay.
So what was that like?
Well, I think once it took me a minute just to drop into the exercise of, this exchange. It's like, okay, I'm using my imagination in a way, but it's also real. Like there's also a reality to it.
Yeah.
And it felt like I could feel actually my upper chest, my heart and throat kind of relaxing and opening.
Yeah.
There's a certain kind of ease that emerged quite quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's the remarkable thing is that they all answer the questions the same way. They all have the same attitude. They all have more or less the same look. They all answer the questions the same way. They're all ultimately a little more interested in their own survival than in your betterment.
Right.
And as long as you promise them that they can survive, they're willing to give up the reins. And that's kind of stunning to me, right? What it tells me, among other things, is that everybody who isn't schizophrenic or in some other way seriously chemically off balance or sociopathic, if that's different, which means most of us have the exact same inner critic creature inside us, around us, talking to us, the same magnitude, saying the same things, behaving the same way. And they're all telling us that we're 6-year-olds. Because notice one thing, one thing you notice, the more time you spend with it and listen to what it's actually saying, is that it has circular logic. Oh, you need more friends. Why do I need more friends? Because more friends are better than fewer friends, right? Not sure that's true. Maybe I don't need to spend as much time on Instagram, right? They speak in circular logic, and they're idiots. They only say the same things over and over again that are aimed at the understanding of a 6-year-old. And yet, as a mature adult, by the time you're 17, you make far more sophisticated risk benefit analyses in the decisions that you make than this thing could possibly understand or care about or remind you of or help you with. They're of no help to you. You've integrated all of their simple lessons into you, and you're a more sophisticated being who isn't bent to the bad, who doesn't need a parent hovering around. By the way, I can use the term idiot or moron or imbecile because it's not a real being. Right? It's the facsimile of a scornful parent. And its only job is to help a 6-year-old become a 17-year-old. And when the 17-year-old arrives, you should have gotten a diploma that said you don't need mommy and daddy hanging around as a scornful attitude in order to be a good person, in order to survive, in order to thrive in the world. And by the way, if you don't have that, a lot of your troubles are going to disappear because it's the only thing that's exaggerating danger.
One of the things that I really was touched by in the book was where you talk about this idea of productivity. You talk about this kind of social, cultural conditioning that's involved in this inner critic and this super ego, and how it doesn't let us be at rest, play, dream, relax, and all of our value is on what we're achieving, what we're producing, what we're doing. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, we think of we're taught and we're encouraged to believe that our highest self is our most serving the species self, right? Serving others self, and that everything else is slightly suspicious because it might be selfish, right? And that we need to do more for others. We need to be more concerned about others and less concerned about ourselves. And what no one ever tells you is, oh, that's restoring you within human law back to your most biological self, right? So we're born like dogs are born, or wolves, or monkeys, or bees. We're born as pack animals, right? And pack animals serve the pack. And pack animals don't have self-reflection like human beings do. And so they can only serve the pack. They don't have a sense of self that they are serving. They can they may have the rule of the pack, like the rule of monkeys might be you get your own food, but that's just instinct, right? That's not anything that prevents them from, in the sense of being serving their species, being helpful to the pack.
Yeah.
So weirdly, for some reason, we were given the ability to step out of serving the pack and step into an appreciation of the world as is, an appreciation of love, an appreciation of ourselves, an appreciation of all of that. We're told that's got no value by the inner critic, right? The inner critic tells us, stay productive, stay serving the pack. Human law all restrains us to force us back into serving the pack. Be better with other people. If you believe that, right, you're never going to be good enough. And if you believe that, you're only going to see that the world is a dissatisfying place that needs improvement. And yes, the species has this species-wide self-improvement plan that everybody is bought into and that we're part of, and we have a certain amount of interest in. But I also get to be interested in the world as is, as if I was allowed some time for simply enjoying things, as if there was nothing wrong with being content part of the day.
Mm-hmm.
If your inner critic is always telling you to be dissatisfied by what is and look for something better, then you can't do that. You can't come to a notion of Buddhist equanimity. You can't come to a simple satisfaction. You feel like, wow, my moments of satisfaction are great gifts that only appear episodically in my life. They can't be a steady part of life. And to me, I'm just repeating what Jesus was saying, right? Jesus said, critically, he said, render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, the social life, the species life, the life of politics, the life of theology, the religion, the life of the human rules of interaction, the life of improvement of the citizenry, the life of serving other people, right? As a moral function that leads to a political betterment of the people. And render unto God that which is God's. Well, if you look closely, Jesus is always spending his time talking about the world of God. He's not talking about politics. He's not talking. If he had been talking about politics, he might have been able to save his life, right? But that's not the world that he was engaged with. He was basically, among other things, saying you have the requirement as a participant in the divine to notice the divine around you and to spend time in it, clear of judgment, clear of hierarchy, clear of social betterment. And that's a very, very hard thing to imagine for most people. And it's not something that's talked about in the pulpits of Christian churches, right? You're not going to hear people in the pulpits of Christian churches saying, Jesus never actually gave a political opinion. And, Jesus actually doesn't tell you that serving people is the highest good, right? That's been added. Jesus was a guy like Buddha who was wandering around looking at things and going, wow, it's crazy. Everything's upside down here. The poor people are the kind, generous people. The rich people are the kind of mean-spirited people. And yet everybody wants to be a rich person. Nobody wants to be a poor person. Me, I want to be a poor person, right? Not because they're poor, but because that's where I'm going to find generosity of spirit. right? Those are weird lessons, and they are not taught in elementary school or even in church usually.
I'm curious to ask you, Annie, do you think that, and then I want to take a couple minutes to address a couple of audience questions. I'm just curious, Annie, do you think that this voice shows up differently in women than it does in men because of the social cultural conditioning?
Definitely a lot more criticism of the body and of a concern about the weight and a terroristic attack on anything over 1 to 2 pounds of weight gain. And definitely in the looks, I think men really have a lot of freedom in how they look and how they present. Women really haven't until, I mean, things started changing with the women's movement, but I would say 20%.
Yeah. By the way, I see in the chat something about IFS, and I did want to mention this.
Sure, yeah.
Because I know a lot of people out there do find IFS just a brilliant.
That's internal family systems.
Internal family systems. And this looks like IFS, and it looks different from IFS. If you're in IFS, I think you can read my book in such a way that you can see that the inner critic starts out as an angel and clearly has a beneficial purpose and is a delightful thing to have inside. But then when it outstays its welcome, it needs to be retired. And I'm always tempted to think it's just an unattached burden at that point, but maybe it's not. I could be convinced that I do tell people, put it back in your head, don't fight with it. But I don't think it can be molded to become, again, beneficial to you. You don't need it. Your authentic self has all of the lessons that it was able to bring to you, and your authentic self doesn't need a new protector.
Okay, that's a really good distinction to understand. Yeah, thanks for that.
I also think that it may be a really easy entry doing the technique with the separating it out and talking to it. Maybe an easy entry into IFS. I'm not sure. I didn't know about IFS when I wrote the book.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it seems it's like it's a universal reality, these parts of ourselves, and being able to communicate with them and integrate them in different ways.
And the difficulty is that if you ask me, I'll tell you, yeah, after you're 17 years old, you could call this a bad part, right? You don't want to, because you don't want to get into a fight with it. You want it to stay kind of relatively benign, and it curates all conflict. And so let it hang around. Don't try to be perfect, but there's no point to trying to convert it into something useful. It's simply outlived its usefulness.
Right. Maybe we can attend to one audience question. There's a really nice one here from Jennifer, who says, do you have advice on how to help children overcome their emerging inner critics? My son is 7.5, and I know the critic is coming. I'd love to be proactive and stop it before it starts.
No, don't stop it. It is necessary. Your kid has to have something accompanying him or her or them when they're crossing the street. So there is nothing wrong with this punishing voice within its intent and first purpose. What I tell people is, when your kid is 17, or somewhere around there, sit them down and tell them, you don't need me or a fake me hanging around. You know how to operate in the world. You can make perfectly good adult decisions. You're not a child. And you can trust that you're going to be making good versus good decisions. Things are going to go sideways, but you don't need this. And maybe you want to get rid of it.
Okay. So it needs to serve its purpose at that age. That's the point.
Yeah, it's beneficial. And I know we all wish it was nicer, but how else do you teach a kid not to run in front of a moving car?
Before we go, Annie, I wanted to ask you, you have a new book coming out in a few months. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, 6 weeks, actually. It's my 20th book on my 70th birthday, and it's called Somehow Thoughts on Love. And it's a book I wanted to leave behind for when I'm gone, so that my son and grandson will know really everything I know about anything that might work, no matter what their futures hold, which I think might be kind of scary because of climate change and the coming election and whatnot. So it's all the different realms of love that have always worked before to help us out of really deep holes.
Oh, that sounds beautiful. I look forward to reading it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and it's really been a treat to have you both here with us today. Thanks so much for taking the time. And just reminding people, we've been speaking to Annie Lamott and Neal Allen, and of course, Neal's the author of this new book, Better Days, Tame Your Inner Critic, and Anne wrote the foreword. It is a very useful book, and I'm looking forward to keeping it there as something to refer to when I need a little bit of support, and using the exercises and insights that are in it. So thanks so much, Neal.
Thank you. That was very nice.
And thanks, Anne, for being here. It's really lovely to see you both.
Thank you so much for having us, Ross. And thank you, Jacob, for engineering this hour we've gotten to spend together.
And thank you, all you people, for listening
Banyan
to us.
Books. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom, a podcast of Banyan Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. The show is edited by Abdo Habani. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyan Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyan.com.